Okay, so, we're talking about urban development in India, and it's kind of striking. You
Right.
see all this stuff about, green buildings and all this progress, but then
Right.
on the other hand, you have this idea of the 2-hour city where
Hmm.
people are just spending hours
Yeah.
stuck in traffic and pollution, and it makes you wonder, what's the reality here?
I think that's a great place to start because it really kind of highlights a core issue.
Yeah.
With urban sustainability in India, it's not just about, isolated green buildings.
Mm.
It's really about the entire, urban ecosystem,
Yeah.
how it works,
Yeah.
and how people actually experience life in the city.
Exactly. So for anyone listening, especially if you're, prepping for the UPSC
Cool.
exams, we're really going to try to go deep on this topic today. Understand the real challenges that
Yeah.
India's cities are facing and,
Oh,
the governance, the way they're actually managed,
well,
which often gets overlooked.
absolutely.
And most importantly, what can actually be done, what concrete step.
Can we take to make these cities more livable and sustainable for everybody?
Right.
And we have a lot of great information here, from the business standard they've given us, you know,
Absolutely a lot to unpack.
yeah, everything from the, constitutional basis of how cities are run to
Yeah.
some really practical recommendations.
And connecting it back to the UPSC syllabus, it's important to realize this isn't just a geography or economics issue.
Hmm.
It really cuts across so many different topics,
Hmm.
like governance, social justice, environmental sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all connected. So
Key themes.
let's start at the very beginning. How is it that India's cities are governed? Like,
Yeah.
what's the setup, the basic setup?
So the foundation really is the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act back in 1992.
Okay, 1992.
And this was a really big step because it tried to kind of formalize urban governance
Mm.
by giving constitutional status to what we call urban local bodies, or ULBs for short.
Okay, ULB's got it.
Right. And it mandated that, based on the population, you'd have different types of ULBs. Okay.
So for the big metropolitan areas, you have municipal corporations.
Mm,
Then for the smaller cities, municipal councils. And for those areas that are kind of transitioning
right.
from rural to urban, you have Nagar panchayats.
I see. Okay. So different levels for different sizes of cities makes sense?
Exactly. Now, along
Yeah.
with this came the 12th schedule, which is really important because
Until schedule.
it laid out 18 specific functional areas that were supposed to be devolved
Mm.
to these ULBs.
So these are the things that the city governments are actually responsible for.
Exactly. And it's a pretty comprehensive list.
Yeah.
It covers things like urban planning,
Okay.
water supply,
Yeah.
solid waste management, public health, slum improvement,
Hmm.
even urban forestry. So really the essential elements of making a city function.
That sounds pretty good.
Right.
On paper, it sounds like they have a lot of power.
Right. And that's where it gets interesting because
Okay.
in theory, it's this powerful step towards more autonomy for cities.
Right.
But the reality
Yeah.
is a bit more complicated. How does this actually play out in practice?
Yeah. So how does it actually work? Like, who are the players involved?
So within each ULB, they envisioned this three-tiered structure.
Okay. 3 tiers.
So first you have the elected wing.
Hmm.
These are the people directly chosen by the city residents.
Right.
You have the mayor and the municipal councilors.
Okay.
Then you have the executive wing.
Hmm.
And this is usually headed by a municipal commissioner or a chief executive officer.
Okay.
Now, these folks are typically appointed by the state government.
Ah, so there's already that state level influence.
Exactly. And then the third tier, you have what are called deliberative bodies.
Okay.
So things like ward committees and standing committees,
I see.
these are meant to focus on specific areas of governance.
So you have the elected officials, the state appointed administrators, and then
Right.
these committees all working together in theory.
In theory, right.
Right.
But there's a key question that comes up, and this is something to really pay attention to
Oh.
for the UPSC, because
Yeah.
just because the 12th schedule lists these 18 functions
Right.
doesn't mean the ULBs automatically get full control over them.
So it's not like a guarantee that they have that power?
Exactly. It's up to each state legislature to decide how much power responsibility
Oh.
and, crucially, how much funding these local bodies actually get.
That's a pretty big loophole.
It is, and it creates a lot of variation across India in how much autonomy ULBs really have.
I see. So it's not just a simple, national level law that
Mhm.
applies the same way everywhere.
Right, and this kind of structural weakness, this lack of, true decentralization,
Mm.
it really contributes to a lot of the problems we see in urban governance.
Okay, so that's one layer then. But the business standard also talks about
Yes.
other organizations that are involved in urban development, not just the elected officials.
Right. So beyond the kind of directly elected and administrative arms,
Hmm.
you have these other agencies that often wield a lot of influence.
Okay.
These are often called parastatal agencies.
Hmm.
Things like development authorities, water supply boards, transport corporations. And the interesting thing is that these are often controlled by the state government.
Right.
And they can sometimes operate pretty independently of the ULBs.
Even though it might be something that falls under that 12th schedule we talked about.
Exactly. So there can be overlap and potential for conflict there.
Right.
You also have the state, town, and country planning departments.
Okay.
They're usually the ones who come up with the master plans that guide a city's long-term development.
The big picture stuff.
Exactly. And then you have the urban development authorities, or UDAs.
Okay, UDAs.
And they tend to focus on the bigger picture, metropolitan and regional planning initiatives.
So it's like this whole, multi-layered system
Yeah.
with the local bodies, the state-appointed folks, and then these other agencies. And it does,
Like, it can get messy.
yeah, it does sound like it could get really complicated.
Yeah, and that fragmentation, that's a big part of the problem because it leads directly to some of the most pressing issues that India's cities are facing.
And you mentioned that earlier, like that contrast we see
Right.
between the, very wealthy areas and then the informal settlements.
Exactly, and maybe the most obvious example of that is
Right.
urban inequality and segregation.
Yeah. It's so stark in many Indian cities, you see.
It is.
Yeah, these pockets of extreme wealth right next to these sprawling slums.
Right, and the business standard really points out how urban planning often seems to prioritize those affluent areas.
You're right.
You have all these gated communities, luxury towers, all that.
Absolutely. And it's really important for those prepping for the UPSC to understand that this spatial segregation, it's not random. It's often a direct result of planning decisions
Right.
that choose to put infrastructure and amenities in certain areas.
And neglect others.
Exactly. And that has a huge impact on, basic things like clean water,
Yeah.
sanitation, transportation for a huge chunk of the urban population.
Yeah. And when you consider that, over 25% of urban India lives below the poverty line,
Right. It's a huge number. That's 81 million people. It's just a massive scale.
it really highlights the magnitude of the problem.
Yeah. And on top of that, you have the environmental challenges,
Right.
especially with climate change. Cities are getting hotter, more vulnerable.
Absolutely. This is becoming a really critical issue.
Yeah.
Indian cities are basically turning into urban heat islands.
Heat islands. I like that.
And there are several things contributing to this.
Okay.
You have all these buildings being built with materials that absorb heat,
Right.
the green spaces, the trees that naturally cool things down are disappearing.
Yeah. Less and less green space.
And then people relying more and more on air conditioning,
Right.
which actually pumps more heat out into the environment, making the problem worse.
So it's like a vicious cycle?
It is a kind of negative feedback loop.
Yeah. And the statistics on this are pretty alarming.
Yeah, the business standard points out that heat stress has gone up significantly in recent decades. And we could see massive job losses because people just can't work as productively in extreme heat.
Right. It affects everyone.
Exactly. And it's not just the heat. Our urban infrastructure just isn't prepared
Yeah.
to deal with the extreme weather events that are becoming more frequent. Things like flash floods, long droughts. It's a real concern.
It's like the cities are just not built for this kind of climate.
Yeah, they weren't designed with these challenges in mind.
And we talked earlier about the fragmentation of governance.
Right.
That seems to be a big part of the problem, too.
It is, and this is a crucial point for UPSC aspirants to understand.
Okay.
Because despite the good intentions of the 74th Amendment, trying to empower cities,
Right.
Indian ULBs are often still very weak politically and financially. They don't have the resources or the authority to really address these problems.
So they're kind of stuck.
In a way, and it's getting worse because there's this trend of outsourcing important urban planning functions to either parastatal agencies or private consultants.
So they're not even doing the planning themselves.
Exactly. And often this happens with very little transparency or public consultation.
So the people who live in the city don't even have a say.
It undermines the whole idea of local democracy.
It really does.
And on top of that, you have this functional fragmentation.
Right. Different departments not talking to each other.
Exactly. Different agencies working in silos with no coordination.
Leading to inefficiency and wasted resources.
Exactly. Duplication of effort.
Yeah.
all sorts of problems.
Yeah, and the CAG report found that only a tiny fraction of the functions listed in that 12th schedule have actually been given to ULBs.
Yeah, it just shows you the disconnect between the idea and the reality.
It's a big gap, and then there's the funding issue too, right?
Absolutely. The amount of money that the central government gives to city governments, it's incredibly low, only about 0.5% of GDP.
That's so little. How are they supposed to do anything with that?
It severely restricts their ability to address these challenges.
Yeah. Okay, so another big part of this 2-hour city problem is obviously traffic, the congestion, the just insane amount of traffic in Indian cities.
Yeah, urban mobility is a huge issue.
Yeah.
And the current model in India is very car-centric.
It is. Everyone wants a car.
And that creates a whole cascade of problems.
Yeah.
You have terrible air pollution, noise pollution. People are wasting hours stuck in traffic.
Wasting time, energy, money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just not efficient. And then you have the issue of last mile connectivity.
Right, like getting from the bus stop to your actual destination.
Exactly. And the infrastructure for walking and cycling is often
it's not great.
non-existent or very dangerous.
Dangerous, yeah. So people feel like they have to drive.
They're forced into using private vehicles.
So even though we've seen some progress with metro networks.
Right, and that's a good thing that we now have over 1,000 kilometers of metro lines.
Across 17 cities, that's impressive.
It is a positive development.
Yeah.
But the problem is that the infrastructure for walking and cycling hasn't kept pace.
Right, it's like we're building these big systems, but not thinking about how people actually get to and from them.
Exactly, and the business standard really emphasizes that.
Yeah.
We need to invest in what they call active mobility infrastructure.
Right.
Making it safe and convenient for people to walk or bike for those shorter trips.
And it's not just about convenience, it's about people's lives. You know?
Yeah, right.
They're spending, on average, 1.5 to 2 hours every day just sitting in traffic.
It's a huge drain on their time, their well-being.
Yeah, and it affects their productivity, the economy, everything.
It has ripple effects throughout society.
Okay, so another thing that's closely tied to all of this is this idea of informality, in jobs and housing.
Absolutely. This is a critical aspect.
A lot of people have moved to the cities.
Right.
But they haven't necessarily found good jobs or affordable places to live.
Right. Urbanization in India hasn't translated
Yeah.
into secure jobs or decent housing for most people.
It's like they're trading one set of problems for another.
In a way, and it's striking that over 90% of employment in India is informal.
90%.
Which means no job security, no benefits.
And it makes it incredibly hard to find decent housing.
Exactly, because the housing market is just so unaffordable for most people.
Yeah.
Which is a big reason why we see these massive slum populations.
Right. We talked about the numbers earlier. Something like 236 million people living in slums.
In 2020, yeah, almost half the urban population.
It's mind-boggling. And then you have the whole thing with the pandemic.
Right.
And how the recovery has been very uneven.
It's been this K-shaped recovery.
Right. Where some people are doing better.
The formal sector has largely bounced back.
Yeah.
But those in the informal economy are struggling even more.
It's like it's just widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Absolutely exacerbating existing inequalities.
Okay, and then you layer on top of that the environmental degradation.
Right.
It's like a perfect storm.
It is. And this is where that socioeconomic vulnerability really comes into play. Because when people are just focused on survival day to day,
Yeah, they're not thinking about the environment.
it's not their top priority. And so you see this rapid urbanization
Yeah.
leading to less green cover destruction of wetlands.
Which are so important.
Absolutely vital for the ecosystem.
Yeah, and then pollution of water resources.
It's all connected.
Yeah, it's like this cycle of, development at any cost.
Right.
And the environment is the one that suffers.
And that makes cities even more vulnerable to shocks like natural disasters.
And then you have the air pollution, which is just off the charts in many Indian cities.
Yeah, the fact that 13 Indian cities were among the world's top 20 most polluted.
Wow.
According to IQera, that's really alarming.
Yeah, and it includes major cities like Delhi, Faridabad. It's a serious problem.
It is a stark reminder of the environmental cost of unsustainable development.
Okay, so the last major challenge that the business standard highlighted is this issue of leadership.
Right.
Or the lack thereof at the city level.
Yeah, the issue of weak mayoral leadership and the lack of real power for elected officials.
Right. And this was really interesting because it seems like in a lot of states, the state-appointed municipal commissioner has way more power than the elected mayor, which seems kind of backwards.
It does contradict the whole principle of local self-governance.
Right. The people choose the mayor, but they don't actually have that much authority.
And it's very different from a lot of successful global cities,
Right.
where the mayor is really a key figure in driving urban policy and development.
So it's like we're setting up these mayors to fail almost.
It can lead to a more top-down bureaucratic approach, which might not be responsive to what the local communities actually need.
It's like this disconnect between the people and the decision makers.
Yeah, and it creates a real barrier to effective urban governance.
So it seems like despite, trying to empower cities with the 74th Amendment,
Right.
there are still these huge obstacles in the way.
It's an ongoing process, and there's a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely. Well, on a more positive note, the business standard does talk about
Yes.
some things that have worked in other countries.
Right. It's always good to look at what's been successful elsewhere.
Yeah, and see if we can learn from them. So what are some of the international best practices that they highlighted?
So one really interesting concept is the 15-minute city.
Okay, the 15-minute city. What's that?
So this was pioneered in Paris, and the idea is that people should be able to access all their daily needs, everything from work to groceries to leisure, within a 15-minute walk or bike ride from their home.
Wow, that's ambitious.
It is, but it really forces you to think differently about how you design a city.
Yeah, to make it more localized.
Exactly. Less car-dependent, more focused on walkable neighborhoods.
So instead of everyone having to commute long distances,
Right.
everything they need is right there.
And that has implications for zoning, for transportation, for everything.
I see. So it's not just about the 15 minutes. It's about this whole shift in thinking.
Exactly. It's a paradigm shift.
Okay. Another one they mentioned is transit-oriented development.
Right. And this is something that's been done very successfully in Tokyo. Okay. And it's really relevant for India because we're investing so much in metro systems.
Right.
So the idea is that you integrate housing, commercial activities, essential services, all around these public transit hubs.
So it's like building the city around the transportation system.
Exactly. So people can easily access everything they need without relying on cars.
It makes so much sense. Like, we're doing it backwards here.
It's a different approach, and it can really reduce traffic congestion.
Right. And then there's this idea of sponge cities.
Yeah, this has been implemented in China, and it's really interesting,
Okay.
especially for cities like Mumbai and Chennai that are prone to flooding.
Yeah.
So sponge cities use green infrastructure and urban design
Okay.
to actually absorb and filter rainwater.
So, like, what kind of things are we talking about?
Things like constructed wetlands, green roofs, permeable pavements.
So instead of the water just running off,
Right.
it's actually being absorbed.
Exactly. It's a way of working with nature
Yeah.
rather than trying to fight it with concrete and pipes.
I like that, working with nature.
And it can make cities much more resilient to flooding.
So instead of trying to engineer our way out of every problem,
Right.
we're actually using natural solutions.
Exactly. Nature-based solutions.
I like that a lot. And then there's Vienna's approach to affordable housing.
Yeah, they have this really interesting system called inclusionary zoning.
Inclusionary zoning, okay.
So basically, when new residential developments are built, they have to include a certain percentage of affordable housing units.
So it's not just, all luxury apartments.
Right. It's mandated that a portion of the development has to be accessible to lower income groups.
That's pretty smart. It seems like a really effective way
It is.
to make sure that everyone has a place to live.
And it prevents the city from becoming too segregated.
Right. So that could be something we could look at for our own affordable housing programs,
Exactly.
like the PMAU.
Yeah. Integrating those kinds of policies could make a big difference.
Okay. And then there's this example from Porto Alegre, which is really intriguing. They do something called participatory budgeting.
This is a really cool idea.
Yeah.
So basically, the citizens get to directly decide
Wow.
how the city's budget is allocated.
So it's not just the politicians making all the decisions.
Exactly. It gives people a real voice in how their city is run.
It's like true democracy in action.
Right. And it can lead to more equitable outcomes.
Yeah, because the people who live in the city know what they need.
Exactly. They're the ones experiencing the problems firsthand.
So that's something that we could definitely learn from.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then on the technology side, there's Talon's digital urban governance platform.
This is a great example of how technology can be used to improve city services.
Okay.
So they have this single digital portal where people can access all sorts of things. Property registration permits utility payments all in one place.
So it's like streamlining the whole bureaucracy.
Exactly, making things more efficient and user-friendly.
So less paperwork, less hassle.
And that could be really valuable for India as we're rolling out our smart cities mission.
Right, and developing that urban DPI, the digital public infrastructure.
Exactly. It's all about using technology to improve people's lives.
And then finally, there's Singapore, which is known for its really innovative approach to building design.
Yeah, they're doing some amazing things with vertical greening and bioclimatic architecture.
Okay, vertical greening, so like plants on buildings.
Exactly. Incorporating green spaces onto the sides and roofs of buildings.
Mm.
And then bioclimatic architecture is about designing buildings in a way that responds to the local climate.
So using natural ventilation, passive cooling techniques.
Exactly. And moving away from those energy-guzzling glass facades.
Which are so common here.
Right. They're not well suited to our climate.
So it's like they're creating these beautiful buildings that are also environmentally friendly.
Exactly. Aesthetically pleasing and sustainable.
I like that a lot. So we have all these great examples from around the world.
Right. And the key is to see what we can adapt to our own context.
Exactly. So bringing it back to India, what are some of the things that the business standard recommends we do to create more sustainable and livable cities?
So based on those global lessons and, the specific challenges we face in India, we really need a comprehensive, multi-pronged approach.
Okay, so hit us with the key points.
All right, so first off, we need to move towards a more place-based and tiered model of urban governance.
Okay, place-based and tiered. What does that mean exactly?
So recognizing that India is incredibly diverse, we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to city management.
Right.
So for the really big cities, the large urban areas, we need to empower metropolitan planning authorities.
Okay, so those are the big guns.
Exactly. But at the same time, we need to strengthen the capacity of the district urban development agencies, the DUDAs, and the state urban development agencies
the CUDAs.
for the smaller towns and cities and those areas that are on the edge of urban areas.
So basically tailoring the governance structure to the specific type of city.
Exactly. And fostering stronger links between rural and urban areas.
Right. So it's not just about the cities in isolation.
Exactly. It's about the whole ecosystem.
Okay. And then, of course, there's the transportation issue.
Absolutely. We need a fundamental shift in how we approach urban mobility.
Right.
We have to move away from this car-centric model.
So less emphasis on cars, more on...
Right. We need to prioritize public transport, walking, cycling.
Okay.
And that means not just building more metro lines and bus systems, but making sure they're well integrated and investing in dedicated, safe, accessible infrastructure for pedestrians and cyclists.
So people actually feel safe and comfortable walking and biking.
Exactly. And aligning all of this with the principles of transit-oriented development.
Right. Building the city around the transportation network.
Exactly. And to really tackle congestion, we need to think outside the box.
Okay. So not just focusing on the cities themselves.
Right. We need to look at what's driving people to migrate to cities in the first place. So we need to strengthen rural infrastructure.
Okay.
Things like healthcare education, digital connectivity, job opportunities.
So making rural areas more attractive.
Exactly. So people don't feel like they have to move to the city to have a good life.
And they also mentioned this idea of counter-magnet cities.
Right. So developing well-planned cities in other parts of the country that can draw people away from the already overcrowded megacities.
So spreading the population out more evenly.
Exactly. And reviving initiatives like PURA, the provision of urban amenities to rural areas.
Okay, PURA.
That can also help to create a more balanced development pattern.
And then there's the whole issue of climate change and how it's affecting cities.
Right. And this is where building design becomes really important.
Yeah, we have to start building smarter.
Absolutely. We need to revamp the National Building Code to make climate-responsive architecture mandatory.
So it's not just an option, it's the law.
Exactly. And that means promoting passive cooling techniques, natural ventilation, using locally sourced sustainable building materials, and really discouraging those energy-intensive glass facades.
Which we see everywhere.
They're just not suitable for India's climate.
And we could also incentivize developers to go green.
Absolutely. Things like linking green building ratings to property tax rebates.
Okay, so like a financial reward for building sustainably.
Exactly. And making energy audits mandatory.
So we know how much energy buildings are actually using.
Exactly. Data is key.
Okay, and then there's the technology side of things.
Right. And it's not just about using technology for the sake of it. It's about integrating it in a way that benefits everyone.
Right.
So, for example, we can combine smart city components with affordable housing schemes like PMAY.
Okay, PMAY plus smart city technology.
Exactly. So you create these inclusive and sustainable neighborhoods with things like rooftop solar panels, gray water recycling systems, smart metering.
So it's like making those basic services more efficient and sustainable.
Exactly. And then there's the potential of using geospatial technology and artificial intelligence.
Okay, those are some powerful tools.
They are. And we can use them for things like slum mapping, redevelopment planning, all sorts of things.
So it's like using data to make better decisions.
Exactly. Evidence-based planning.
And then there's this whole concept of blue-green infrastructure.
Right. This is really important for making cities more resilient to climate change.
Okay.
So we need to bring back those natural elements into the urban fabric.
So things like water bodies, wetlands, green corridors.
Exactly. And we need to protect them and integrate them into our urban planning.
Right.
Designate land for urban forests, bioswales, rain gardens, all that.
Yeah.
And we can link this with national missions like AMRU 2.0 and SBMU 2.0.
AMRT and SBMU. Okay.
Right. Those are existing programs that we can leverage.
And there's cities that are already doing this right.
Yeah. Ahmedabad, Pune. It's a good example.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not just a pie in the sky idea. It's actually happening.
It's possible, and we can learn from those successes.
Okay, so all of these plans sound great, but for them to really work, there has to be a sense of ownership at the local level.
Absolutely. We need strong city-level leadership.
Right.
And that means giving cities real financial power.
So not just telling them what to do, but giving them the resources to do it.
Exactly. So each city needs to develop a climate action plan, a CAP.
Okay, a CAP.
That's tailored to their specific needs and aligned with India's national net zero goals.
Right, so they have a roadmap for how to reduce their emissions.
Exactly, and these CAPs should be supported by adequate funding.
Yeah, where's the money going to come from?
So the Finance Commission could recommend performance-linked grants.
So basically, cities get more money if they meet their targets.
Exactly, it creates an incentive to actually implement these plans.
I like that. And then there's the whole issue of community participation.
Right, we can't just have top-down solutions.
Right, the people who live in the city need to be involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure those ward committees and Mahalla Sabhas are actually functioning.
Right, giving people a voice at the local level.
And we can use tools like citizen report cards, participatory budgeting, to make sure that citizens are engaged in the decision-making process.
And then there's technology, which can help with that too, right?
Absolutely. We need to invest in building a strong urban digital public infrastructure. The DPI.
The DPI, okay.
That allows for real-time monitoring of city services, efficient service delivery.
So it's like making the government more transparent and accountable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure that all these different systems can talk to each other.
Right. Interoperability is key.
Exactly. So we can connect things like property records, utility data, transportation data.
All in one place.
And that can give us incredibly valuable insights for better planning and management.
So it's like using data to make the city work better for everyone.
Precisely data-driven urban development.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive.
Yep.
You know, going through all the challenges and potential solutions that the business standard laid out.
There's a lot to digest.
It is. But it's so important, especially for those of you who are preparing for the UPSC exams.
Absolutely.
So thinking about everything we've talked about today, what are some of the key things that stand out to you? What do you think are the most pressing issues and the most